Welcome to a special edition of our Saturday night class series at LaRouche Pack. Tonight, we're going to honor the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth, or as some might say, LaRouche's 100th birthday, which occurred on Thursday, September 8th, by showing video of a TV commercial, a half-hour TV commercial that Lynn made and aired in 1988, entitled Woman on Mars. I don't have to describe what the video is about because the title is sufficient and you'll see it yourself. But let me set the stage a little bit, because 1988 was, of course, 34 years ago. It was the fourth presidential campaign, Lyndon LaRouche's fourth time he ran for president. The first time was 1976 as a U.S. Labor Party candidate. And then again, he ran in 1980 and 84 and 88 as a Democrat. 1980, his campaign was directed against Jimmy Carter, even though he was running as a Democrat, and helped succeed in dumping Carter, who was a mild version of what we have right now with Joe Biden, and succeeded in bringing about, helping to bring about Reagan's presidency, and especially Reagan's adoption of the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this is one of LaRouche's major accomplishments in his life, and the LaRouche Pack website is filled with a lot of material about LaRouche's concept of the SDI, which was basically a science driver program, not just a military defense program, but a science driver program on which the entire world economy could be reorganized based on rapid development of advanced technologies. Now, this was linked also, in fact, LaRouche said that this was a subset, the SDI was a subset of a space program. And all during his presidential campaigns and during his life, LaRouche emphasized the U.S. space program as exemplary of the kind of science driver programs which are essential to building up the economy. Programs in which man explores the frontiers of science and technology and pushes the boundaries of human capabilities, which then radiates out and organizes the entire economy. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this, which we can do during the Q&A and discussion period, which we'll have afterwards. And Keisha Rogers will be joining us after we show the video, and she will have some very relevant comments to make in this regard. But just to set the stage on the video you're about to see, as I said, this was a campaign advertisement. LaRouche actually was the first candidate to pioneer half-hour television broadcasts. He set the goal, the idea of that. And in this particular campaign in 1988, I think he made 8 or so half-hour television broadcasts. Now, since some of you who are watching this probably were either not alive or very young in 1988, let me remind you that this was before cable TV or the internet. So a half-hour video on national television was a big deal. There were only 3 major networks, and to get them to put on your show for a half hour required a substantial amount of money. In this case, it was about $250,000, which in today's dollars would be about $650,000. And most of that money, in fact, all of that money came from small dollar contributors to LaRouche's presidential campaign. And I would just point out that this show received very interesting response. It had a very electric response especially from young people who were young at the time, who would now be people in their, I'd say, 40s, 50s, and also from older people, World War II generations, people in the of LaRouche's age, who remember the Roosevelt period and lived through the Kennedy program, and they have since obviously passed. Most of them have passed on. But there was somewhat of a muted response from my generation, from the baby boomer generation, who had been brainwashed during the 1970s, 60s, and 70s to reject the idea that they had grown up with of scientific progress and to accept the kind of ideas which right now we're battling: zero growth, Malthusian policies, anti-science environmentalism, things which actually, although extreme at the time, would appear mild compared to the radical environmentalists, climate change, zero growth policies which are being pushed today. But LaRouche's intervention into this climate by putting this issue of man's colonization of Mars, prospective colonization of Mars, before the American people as part of a presidential campaign was quite bold. And as I say, the response was absolutely electric on the part of a large part of the American population, but received a tremendous freak out on the part of the mainstream media and the establishment, who ridiculed LaRouche, called him an extremist. In fact, in almost every newspaper article that was published about LaRouche, leading into, but also after this, was after this video was shown, characterized LaRouche as a political extremist who's so crazy he wants to colonize Mars. Well, here we are 34 years later, and the United States, especially because of President Trump's initiative in this regard, has established a policy. It's the official policy of the United States to colonize Mars. Trump, of course, had a very aggressive program for that, and so do others, such as Elon Musk, who has been promoting a Mars development program and so forth. But this would be very important for shifting the direction of the U.S. and world economy, precisely because it would require the development of technologies which we do not now have. And Keisha will discuss that irony of that in somewhat after the show. Before we show it, though, I want to point out one other thing that LaRouche emphasized, that in addition to the developments in technology that are associated with something like a Mars colonization program, there's a cultural shift that occurs, that in which you change the culture of the people, gradually shifts from a culture of pessimism that was prevalent at the time. Remember that 1988, we were talking about 1 year after the big financial collapse, a period about after roughly 15 years since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and the period in which the Federal Reserve and Wall Street were engaged in the beginnings of the wild monetary and financialization policies, which right now have gotten completely out of control. There was a lot of pessimism about the future of the country and of the world at this time. But LaRouche understood that the way to shift this pessimism was not to just go preach to people about what they already agreed, but to give them a sense of optimism, to create a national sense of optimism, as President Kennedy did with his announcement of the space program in 1962. And again, Keisha will probably have a few comments to make on that. But I want to point out in this regard that you should pay attention to the music that the soundtrack of the film. First of all, you'll hear at the beginning a violin playing a series of notes. And those notes are the notes that Johannes Kepler in the 1600s, the early 1600s, figured out were the frequencies that corresponded to the angular speeds of neighboring planets. And that is the ratios and the frequencies between the Earth and Mars, Mars and Jupiter, etc. We can talk more about that later. And then the music that follows is the string quartet of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart called the Dissonance Quartet, which is actually built up and based from the very same intervals. So I just want to call your attention to that. Now, finally, let me point out that about 2 weeks after this show was aired, LaRouche was indicted in Alexandria, Virginia, and immediately sent to trial and was convicted before the end of the year and sent to prison in the early part of the next year as soon as George H.W. Bush took office. Now, the indictment was not a response to this video. I don't mean to imply that, because the legal attacks against LaRouche had begun long before and had been accelerating over the entire period of the 1980s. Like Trump, the more influential LaRouche got, the more support in the population that he had, the more vicious and aggressive was the use of the weaponization of the justice system and legal attacks against him. And I just want to point that out because you can see what the enemy really hated about LaRouche by looking at this video, which is also the same thing they hate about Trump. The idea that America can be great, that we can accomplish things that nobody thinks we can accomplish, and thereby we can lift mankind out of a sense of despair and into a sense of hope. So with that introduction, I'd like to invite you to spend the next half hour watching this show.
I have the announcement you've been waiting for. As of 5 minutes ago, our environmental systems have been fully stabilized. Man's first permanent colony on Mars is now fully operational.
Good evening. If Lyndon LaRouche becomes president next January, that message from Mars will actually occur 39 years from now. The woman who will speak from Mars was born somewhere in the United States within the last year or two.
Many of you were shocked. Some of you were saying, why is this old geezer talking about a permanent colony on Mars 39 years from now with the major budget problems in Washington today? In a nationwide television broadcast a few weeks ago, I told you that on my first day as president, I should declare a national economic emergency and launch the largest economic recovery program in our history. During each of the first 2 years of my administration, about $2 trillion in low-cost federal loans will be invested in building up our nation's presently rotting industrial infrastructure, plus building up about 5 million new industrial jobs during the first 3 or 4 years of my administration. Looking back to the experience of the 1940-1943 period under President Franklin Roosevelt, we know that the recovery will creak at the beginning, but will build up speed over the first 2 years, so that about the third year, the United States will have the highest per capita income in our history. There are no mysterious tricks involved. It is all basic economics modeled upon our successful economic recoveries under Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. However, to keep that recovery going beyond the first 3 to 4 years, and to make our economy once again the most competitive on earth, we must invest in creating new technologies to do that. We must pick up where we left off with the old Apollo program back during the 1960s.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
The old aerospace program of the 1960s paid us back more than 10 cents for every penny we invested in it. This Mars program will pay us back much more. Not 40 years from now, but each year over the 50 years or more to come. This project's spin-offs in the form of new products and new technologies into our civilian economy means that by the year 2027 AD, the average person in the United States will have a real income at least 10 times that of today. As some of you know, my specialty is a branch of science founded by Leibniz called physical economy. Over the years, my associates and I have had the privilege of working with some of the world's leading scientists in plasma physics, optical biophysics, and space technology. What I have done is to put this scientific knowledge together with my own expertise in physical economy, just as I did back in 1982 when I proposed what became known as the SDI. I've also consulted with some leading organizations in Europe, which are already prepared to go to work on some aspects of a Mars colonization program. At an international conference held in Virginia during the summer of 1985, I submitted a paper outlining a 40-year project for establishing a permanent colony on Mars. About a year later, the President's Space Commission proposed a similar Mars project. This is no Jules Verne dream. It is hard science. Every step is based on technologies we shall have ready at the times this Mars project requires them. Tonight, I shall report to you some of the highlights of that Mars program. I shall explain how this project will cause rapid growth in our economy, even during the few years just ahead. The first problem in getting toward Mars colonization is to build a replacement for our present NASA shuttle system. We should use the existing, quite workable shuttle system until we develop its replacement. But we need a system which can put a ton of payload into geostationary orbit about 10 times cheaper than we can do that today. We also need a system that is safer, easier to maintain, and to launch than our present system. We need something which could be made operational in a few years. So I traveled to West Germany to the leading aerospace firm, MBB, which my friends and I had had contact in connection with proposing the development of a West European version of the SDI. MBB is prepared to proceed with a design which was already proposed as the alternative to our present shuttle system back at the beginning of the 1970s. It is called the Zinger Project, named after the leading space scientist who developed it. I propose that our aerospace firms cooperate with the Europeans and Japan in accomplishing this. The Zinger system has two elements. One of the elements is what is called a scramjet. The other is a rocket plane, a replacement for the shuttlecraft, which is piggybacked on the scramjet. The scramjet takes off with the shuttle attached, reaching about 8 times the speed of sound at an altitude of about 150,000 feet. At the top of its flight, the scramjet releases the shuttle, which flies on its own power into low Earth orbit. This scramjet has obvious civilian as well as potential military uses. Potentially, it cuts the cost of getting a ton of payload into space by as much as 90%. My friends in Italy's aerospace industry came up with an improved design for such a scramjet configuration. This is the proposed design, which has many aeronautical advantages, including the ability to take off from ordinary airfields. One of the reasons for the curious shape is that our Italian friends have used what is called the Bozeman biplane principle to lessen the drag. The development of this new shuttle system means the early development of several new industries and important improvements in the construction of ordinary automobiles as spin-offs.
Improved power plant designs for aircraft and automobiles with fuel economies and reduced pollution from combustion. New kinds of materials, more heat-resistant and stronger, meaning, in addition to other benefits, stronger and safer automobiles. Advanced new basic industries to produce these kinds of materials for general use. Civilian and military aircraft capable of reaching the most distant points in the world from the United States within not more than 3.5 hours.
What propulsion system shall be used for our flight to Mars? For various reasons which I need not discuss here, I requested a propulsion system which could carry a manned spacecraft at a constant acceleration of 1 gravity. One of the solutions provided by the scientists was a 1 terawatt fusion reactor as the propulsion system. I presented my proposals and specifications to a group of scientists in West Germany. They worked through the calculations I proposed and reported back to me a design for a manned spacecraft with an onboard fusion propulsion system operating with 1 terawatt of power. The United States has been working on designs for fusion-powered propulsion systems for about 20 years. One system was outlined by NASA Representative John J. Reineman at an Air Force conference back in 1971.
This early design for a fusion-propelled rocket uses what is known as the magnetic mirror configuration. The fusion reaction takes place in the central cylindrical reaction chamber. The exhaust propelling the spacecraft comes out at the right of this diagram.
Another of the standard designs is one worked out by Lawrence Livermore Laboratory.
In this design, the payload is at the front of the spacecraft, connected to the propulsion system by a 20-ton truss. A small megawatt power source is built into the propulsion system. An automated factory inside the unit makes the fusion pellets and feeds them into the engine. 200 krypton fluoride lasers are aimed at the pellets to produce the fusion propulsion.
25 years from now, we shall have more advanced designs. We shall have plants producing a terawatt of output and using helium isotope 3 mined from the moon's surface as a basic fuel for travel between Mars and Earth. We know already the lines of research and development we must follow. The schedule I've chosen for completing this is well within safe limits of estimate. The two designs identified give you a general idea of the system. With this system, a manned craft leaving an orbiting space station above Earth could reach the orbit around Mars in an average of less than 48 hours. For the giant unmanned freighters, we would use the same propulsion system to make the journey more slowly in a period of weeks.
LaRouche applied his professional skills as a physical economist to work out preliminary designs for the new cities to be built on Mars. This is an artist's drawing of LaRouche's original design. When the Mars construction is completed, the lower half of the geodesic domes you see here would be under the surface of Mars. The central dome is the living space for the members of the colony, with a large educational park at the center. The outer domes are areas for production and the growing of food supplies. What you now see is a cross-section of the center geodesic dome from top to bottom. The inhabitants of the city live in the upper half of the dome. Transportation, storage, and utilities are underneath. The inner dome has 12 transportation pathways leading from the central park to the outer rim and to the production areas beyond. Not shown here are circular transportation tracks, each spaced at distances consistent with Kepler's third law. Shown on your screen is a spiral pathway cutting across the other lines of movement within the city.
There are some very important laws of physics involved in effecting this design. In the past, many of the best designed cities on Earth were designed according to similar principles. I think I can predict safely that all human colonies in space will be built according to the same basic principles I've used in this design. Now it seems that we shall go back to such sound principles of city building on Mars and perhaps in the Sahara Desert before we begin to rebuild our oldest cities on Earth in ways better suited to the physical and psychological needs of human beings. In order to colonize Mars, we must create mining and fabricating industries on the moon. These would be largely automated industries based on the new energy systems and laser-related tools we are now in the process of developing. To give you a rough idea of what the scientists have presented to me, this means power plants with about 1,000 times more output than a power plant on Earth today, with an effective operating temperature at least 10 times that of any power plant on Earth now. With this kind of power, we can be assured of increasing the average output of wealth per person about 10 times today's level within a period of between 1 and 2 generations. As a result of this and other features of the project, we may expect to increase the average income of the United States by up to 10% per year average by some point during the coming 10 years, with about 5% average growth in real income during the coming 10 years. Put it the other way around. Without a science driver project, such as this Mars project, the United States economy would not become competitive again, and there would be very slow improvement in incomes beyond the levels we should reach by about 1994, 1995. There are 2 reasons we must choose a Mars project as the way to achieve the rates of economic growth needed. First, there are powerful reasons we must have a colony on Mars. To achieve certain very specific kinds of scientific breakthroughs we shall need on Earth, we must do the kind of astrophysical research we cannot do without a Mars project. The practical purpose is to build up a system of giant radio telescopes as far away from the sun as possible. To sustain the scientists and engineers working on these space laboratories, we need a nearby logistical base. To support those scientists and engineers requires a population about the size of a medium-sized city on Earth. Since Mars is the nearest location which meets the requirements, we must colonize Mars. The second reason is that the Mars project uses every frontier technology we might expect to develop during the coming 50 years of scientific research. That means that the space program will be supplying our civilian industries with the most advanced technologies possible at the most rapid rate, putting the United States permanently in first place in technology. These technologies include plasma processes, which are not only energy sources for all mankind during the coming 50 years and more, but also the new basic industrial technologies. Once we can bring sufficient cheap energy to bear, not only to boil tungsten, but to heat it into a plasma state, all limits to natural resources, as we now define such limits, cease to exist. A second related technology is that represented in a primitive way by today's laser machine tools. This means controlling the entire electromagnetic spectrum as the basic tool of production for uncounted centuries still to come. A third technology is modern optical biophysics, perhaps the only technology which will enable us to provide cures for such diseases as cancer and AIDS. Apart from human health needs, this is the great revolution in biology for the remainder of this century and the next. Every other breakthrough in technology we can foresee, until the time we master what we call the anti-matter reaction as an energy source, will fall among these 3 categories of scientific research and development. By putting all these technologies into a single mission-oriented research and development project, we are able to ensure that the United States will be first in technology for 50 years to come. With this Mars program, we can assure every one of you that your children and grandchildren have the opportunity for a bright future. That, in my opinion, is the true mission of government.
Lyndon LaRouche sums up his report by describing the way in which the Mars mission project will spill new technologies and entirely new industries into an expanding job market.
As president, I shall call together the representatives of industries, including the automotive and aerospace sector. I shall say to them, ladies and gentlemen, I need your cooperation to give the United States the world's most advanced tool industry. I shall wrestle with the Congress to provide such legislation as we need for you to do your job properly. We are going to get the last disgusting vestige of decay, pollution, and poverty out of this nation's life. And you are going to play a key part in bringing this about. It will work like this. First, as I told you in my broadcast several weeks ago, we are going to pour about $2 trillion a year of low-cost credit into infrastructure and industrial expansion. Second, we're going to have an emergency tax reform which stimulates investment with investment tax credit incentives. Third, the research and development of the project will be tightly interfaced with the growth of our modernized tool sector. This means that the tool sector will have the new technologies available as rapidly as they're developed. It means that industry can obtain uses of these technologies as rapidly as they are developed. With ample low-cost credit for investments in new technologies, plus investment tax credit incentives, our national economy will achieve the highest rate of technological growth in history. This will require sweeping improvements in public school education. It requires more classics and science in the schools. It will require National Science Foundation scholarships and merit pay increases for teachers, and will require National Science Foundation assistance to local schools in providing the exhibits and other teaching materials needed to introduce students to the new space-age technologies. This requires a shift away from present trends in business education to produce more managers qualified in production technologies. It means a much better way to live than the drab misery, illiteracy, and decay into which our nation has been drifting the past 20 years. Then, 39 years from now, we shall hear the broadcast from Mars announcing that the first permanent colony there is operational. Among those colonists will be some of the children and grandchildren of you watching this broadcast tonight. Many of you will be watching that first television broadcast from that new colony. Already, the woman who will speak to you then from Mars has just recently been born somewhere in the United States. We shall give our nation once again that great future which our children and grandchildren deserve.
Okay, so I hope that was inspiring. I think Keisha has a few remarks she'd like to make. And there she is on Mars.
Hello. Well, that was extraordinary. And I think most who watched that were totally inspired and know that it is time to fulfill the vision of Lyndon LaRouche and ensure that bright future that he so fought for. And I was thinking back to the fact that if we commit ourselves again to the type of science driver projects, the type of mission orientation that LaRouche and visionary leaders before him put forward, then we can solve any problem confronting mankind. And this is why we have to ensure that all systems are go on Mars, that we achieve that permanent colony on Mars. It's far past time to achieve the goals that Lyndon LaRouche set forth and that vision that he put forth for a 40-year perspective and plan. And I want to share, only 12 years old when Lyndon LaRouche gave that video and that broadcast, that television nationwide broadcast. And if we all know that today, this weekend, we're actually celebrating the anniversary of the very visionary speech of President John F. Kennedy, as President Kennedy in 1962, September 12th, which is coming up on this Monday, made these remarkable commitment for our nation. And what Kennedy was doing was, as Lyndon LaRouche pointed out in his video, that the objective was far beyond the moon. The objective actually was to do these and the others things, which Kennedy laid out a program, that NASA laid out a program for sending human beings to Mars. And that was going back to the 1960s, and that we had a program to actually send human beings to Mars by 1980s. And that program was defined by a commitment toward exploring advanced propulsion systems, nuclear power. At that time, many people may know that President Kennedy, that NASA in particular, even after the assassination of President Kennedy, put forth an optimistic program in terms of testing out through their NERVA program, the advancements of nuclear propulsion systems, nuclear thermal propulsion systems at that time, and that we were well on our way to establishing that commitment toward sending Americans, advancing American progress in space and on our way to Mars. And the last time that we sent with our 6 missions to the moon, after President Kennedy in 1962 made this speech, it was 8 years later in 1969 that we sent the first human beings to the moon and returned them safely to Earth, that we had 12 astronauts on 6 missions to go. There were a lot more missions planned. But in 1973, after the last mission, this is when the vision that had been set forth by President Kennedy that would advance our space program, that had set into motion the greatest science driver in economic technological progress, as we heard from the video there, was crushed by the budget cutters, the environmentalists. And it was Lyndon LaRouche who continued that mission in terms of the fight for space exploration and these greatest science driver and technological progress. And so about 4 years later, after the last human beings landed on the moon, Lyndon LaRouche put out founded what was called the Fusion Energy Foundation. They put out reports. Many people probably saw these reports. If you look at this date, this is the year I was born, around this time in this year. And what the Fusion Energy Foundation was doing is it Lyndon LaRouche, as he stressed, was in collaboration with numerous scientists, engineers, some of the greatest visionaries, rocket scientists. And at that time, he was advancing, and they were working on some of the most advanced propulsion systems and going into research on advanced fusion, thermonuclear fusion energy systems. And so this is when it was what led to what Lyndon LaRouche had developed with the woman on Mars, and shaping the technologies and understanding of how we would get there. And one of the greatest inspirations to what Lyndon LaRouche continued to develop was the vision of a space pioneer by the name of Craft Erica. Many of you have heard us speak of Craft Erica, and you saw this photo on the video of this schematic of a lunar colony. And this is Craft Erica's, his lunar base, which he called Selenopolis. And this was the Craft Erica laid out an entire lunar industrialization program, as Lyndon LaRouche had called for and had developed. He had already developed this, and they later started to collaborate together on such a program. And that lunar industrialization program was being developed and designed to lead the way for utilizing in situ resources on the moon. And we know that one of the biggest advancements that LaRouche made was recognizing the role of helium-3, advanced power sources, advanced elements on the moon that would actually help us to power rockets to Mars. So this is in 1986. You had as LaRouche showed, the science and technologies needed to colonize Mars. And this report, I'm actually going to put it, make it available to people. But I wanted to share, because at the time that Lyndon LaRouche was designing this 40-year perspective, 40-year science driver program for Mars exploration, the technologies and advancements that were needed to carry out that vision and mission, as he pointed out in his video, this was a time that the administration, the Reagan administration, was actually putting forth a program in fulfillment of that quality of the pioneering of space, a 50-year outlook. And so I did find that report that he mentioned on pioneering space, the space frontier, and that was around 1986, not long around the same time that Mr. LaRouche came out with this program here. And I just wanted to share that when you look at this program about pioneering space, America's frontier in space for 50 years perspective, in that report that they put out, it's a pretty extensive report, but they start off by talking about the fact that they were looking at what the scientific developments and all of the advancements that we had made as a society from 1935 to around 1985, right before the report came out. And then they looked at where we needed to be in the following 50 years to 2035, what type of advancements in space science, in new technologies, advanced industries, manufacturing, so forth, that we needed to have. And the mission of that statement was, as was developed, really laid out that type of vision that LaRouche put forward, in terms of that you needed to look at the next 2 or 3 generations to come. And as I said, what what we've seen in terms of what LaRouche understood, that the only way that we were going to get to Mars is that we had to have a propulsion system, advancements in a propulsion system and nuclear power systems that were not only going to transform our living standard, transform our society, our economy here on Earth, but we also had to do the same for advancing propulsion systems to get to Mars. And I wanted to show you that, I want to show you, as LaRouche was talking about, some of the progress that was being made in the advancement of thermonuclear propulsion systems, rocket systems at that time. Well, I would like to go back for a second, because as I said, in the 1960s, we were already testing certain nuclear propulsion systems. But as he told us in the video, that in 1987, around the time that he was producing his Woman on Mars video, and just a few years after the science and technologies needed to colonize Mars, that the Lawrence Livermore laboratories were already achieving breakthrough science in the fields of fusion propulsion systems. And so I found this report, and around the Livermore laboratories here, that was put forward. And in the opening, the report says, the science for harnessing the internal combustion engine of the 21st century, the thermonuclear powered laser fusion reactor, was demonstrated during the 1987 by researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. In August, the Livermore scientists achieved 64,000-fold compression of a tiny pellet of fusion fueled utilizing the 100 trillion watt Nova glass laser system. So that's what was going on at that time. And then you think about it, as I said, the program for what had been set forth going back to the 60s, that was shut down in 1973. LaRouche scientists, some of the greatest scientists and engineers came in and started to develop designs and programs. Well, after that, if you think about it, this question of getting to Mars and where we are today, the fact that for far too long, we have been held back by systems that have become obsolete. And we're still working on the same chemical rocket systems that we had been working on back during the 1960s, and even into the shuttle program into the 1980s. And as people know, right, that this question of getting to Mars means that we have to make sure that we can get people there, as Lyndon LaRouche pointed out with his program for a 1G acceleration in a timely manner, and to make sure that we're not taking 8 months to get to Mars. And with chemical propulsion systems, chemical rockets, and this uses things such as hydrogen, kerosene, or kerosene, methane, so forth, a chemical that you heat up in terms of, but you think about the fact that if we're to use chemical rockets to get to Mars, we're going to have to blast off from Earth into low Earth orbit, and then actually catch the trajectory from the sun into another elliptical orbit that goes into the to the Mars orbit, and that this will take about 8 months. So LaRouche was working on that, he and other scientists, from the standpoint that, okay, this is going to destroy human beings. We're going to have blobs when we get to Mars, that we have to put a stop to this. We have to advance advance our propulsion systems. The amount of radiation that human beings would encounter, both going there on an 8-month plus journey, and especially the resources you're going to have to use coming back, and the exposure to radiation. So these were programs that were being worked on. And so this is where we have to actually solve the problems for today to fulfill that vision that LaRouche set forward, and to ensure that all systems go on Mars. And as today, as we pointed out, we have reaffirmed and recommitted ourselves. And this was 50 years after our last moon landing in 1972, that President Trump, when he was in office, put forth a new commitment for our nation to return the first woman and the next man to Mars. But not only that we were going to do as was very much envisioned and designed from before, that we would actually have the development of the lunar surface, development of the moon, of its resources, and that we would go for sustained presence on the moon, so that we could pave the way and build out the resources needed for going to Mars. And a part of that was understanding from past experiences and from past missions that we learned that there are water resources, water ice on the moon that can help for rocket fuel, that there are other resources that can be utilized for base camps on the moon, for actually paving the way for getting to Mars. But we know what has been the challenge with this. The same operations that were run back in the 1960s, the same operations that railroaded LaRouche into prison, that wanted to do away with such visionary leadership, have been those operations that say this costs too much, that we have to be more concerned about the destruction of human beings on Earth because there's too many of us, and we have to be concerned about climate change. But as Lyndon LaRouche did, Trump put forth this vision, and it's up to us, the American people, to fulfill that vision and to say that we will allow no one or nothing to stand in the way of accomplishing that vision. And so if you think about the fact that this is a Artemis, as President Kennedy developed the mission for, Trump developed the mission for the Artemis program, the twin sister of Apollo, the first generation, the first moon mission that we had. Now we have the opportunity to give our children and grandchildren, as Lyndon LaRouche said, the bright future which they deserve, which has so been taken away from them and destroyed. And so that, as we understand that, that means we actually have to have a mission toward economic progress. Science driver, space has to drive human progress. So with that, I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of my comments, and the optimism that we must have and put forward as we go forward into accomplishing and achieving such a visionary goal in this time of grave danger and crisis that we're facing.